Good day and welcome to this special episode of CDI Talks. My name is Anton Shekhovtsov and I'm the chair of the Center for Democratic Integrity, an Austria-based NGO that analyzes attempts of authoritarian regimes to influence politics in Europe. Today's episode of CDI Talks is special for two reasons. First, this episode focuses on a theme rather than a particular European country as we usually do. Second, in this video I'm talking to a long-time friend and colleague of mine, Andreas Umland, who is also a co-founder of the Center for Democratic Integrity. Andreas is one of the most prolific authors I know, and he has published widely on Russian and Ukrainian politics, nationalism and foreign affairs with a special focus on German foreign policy. He is also the tireless editor of the book series Soviet and Post-Soviet Politics and Society and Ukrainian Voices at ibidem-Press. Andreas is currently a senior analyst at the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. The Stockholm Centre is today the most prominent Swedish national centre of competence that conducts policy-relevant analysis on Russia and Eastern Europe. The most recent piece that Andreas contributed to the Stockholm Centre is a policy paper on 3 strategies for achieving a Ukrainian victory and rebirth. I myself published with the Stockholm Centre. Last year, the Centre published my article on the relations between the Austrian far-right Freedom Party and Russian actors. I will give all relevant links to the papers and reports in the description of this video. I recently caught up with Andreas Umland in Berlin and we discussed launching a new series of conversations under the name Café Eurasia. It so happened that our first contact more than 15 years ago was about our studies of Neo-Eurasianism. And later, during my trips to Kiev, where Andreas is generally based, we would often have lunch at one of the restaurants in the Eurasia chain. If you like the format, we will continue the Café Eurasia conversations as a separate project. So it would be great to hear your comments and opinions in the comment section, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Andreas, hi. It's really good to record this pilot episode of what may become Café Eurasia. I think we know each other more than 15 years now, and we were first connected exactly on the foundation of our studies of Eurasianism. If you remember, Professor Roger Griffin, our friend and mentor, introduced us to each other, and also I remember then when I would go to Kiev, we would go to the restaurant Eurasia. It's very symbolic, with the Asian food, etc. So maybe we will call these series of conversations as Café Eurasia. The other alternative would be Café Europa, but we have this Café Europa or Europa in Vienna, and it's also the title of Drakulich's novel, if you know Drakulich.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Yeah, she wrote a book about her experiences with the breakup of Yugoslavia and with the fate of some of its nations. And today I want to talk also about the breakup, the potential breakup of the Russian Federation, of Russia,
of Eurasia. Some would say.
Of Eurasia, yes. I think that to clarify the framework of this very speculative, actually, conversation. It's not we're not going to refer to any, I think, academic studies. It's just more of a speculation in a way. So I think the framework is that this discussion it could be from fantasies, or between fantasies, to some potential reality. There was recently a very interesting interview with Nina Khrushcheva for Deutsche Welle. In this interview for Deutsche Welle, she basically said that now everything is possible because we live in the times that we live in, they are so turbulent. That everything is possible. And if some people were very skeptical about the very idea of the breakup of Russia recently, now it may become a reality. Yes? So sort of, we live in this liquid modernity, so to say, or liquid post-modernity. So everything is possible, really. So these fantasies on the one hand, and on the other hand, I do believe that in the future, like in 20 or 30 years, Russia will not exist in the same borders as it is today. Maybe there will be no Russia. Yeah? And especially with the rise of technology, with the coming of fourth industrial revolution, I think many things may change where geography will no longer matter, or the land that you actually own may no longer matter. So everything may change. And if we go in time, if we travel in time in 20, 30 years, when we open a textbook on, I don't know, on politics, and we'll say, well, there was this country, Russia, and then there will be a list of factors that contributed to its demise. So, it's between fantasies and potential reality. General Ben Hodges recently said that we should be prepared for the possibility of the breakup of the Russian Federation. And he named some of the factors that could contribute to this, and I would maybe you could comment on them. So the first, he says that some of the 120 ethnic groups see the weaknesses of the Russian army as an opportunity to claim some separate entities, some sovereignty. So what do you think of it?
That's a good point. I think it applies above all, you would probably agree easily, to the Northern Caucasus, where you have these sort of independent traditions with the other ethnic minorities. Who knows? That is more difficult. I think they are probably more Russified, and there may be less of a sort of an ethnically determined, perhaps, drive to independence. Although often, scholars, including us, tend to underestimate the drive of nationalism and of ethnic mobilization. So I have no quick answer to that. Whether this, I would think that rather the dynamic may not be ethnically perhaps determined. It could then become the ethnic movement. So I think the starting point will be basically that parts of the currently official Russian Federation are now anyway not under Russia's control, and they will be even less under Russia's control, namely all the annexed territories, and this will be then suggestive to other territories. And then perhaps the ethnic factor could come in, but I would rather think in terms of perhaps even not apart from the Northern Caucasus, where I think, I don't know what your opinion is. You may know this actually better than me. The people wouldn't mind, actually. Many Russians wouldn't mind if the Northern Caucasus goes.
If you remember, before Navalny, this Russian opposition activist, reinvented himself as a Democrat, he had this slogan, "Хватит кормить Кавказ," so enough of feeding the Caucasus. And but my problem with Ben Hodges' this first factor is that in order, well, first, if Chechnya, for example, separates from Russia, if the Caucasus, entire Caucasus, will separate from the Russian Federation, will it be actually a breakup? In my opinion, it will not be a breakup. It will just, some border territories decided to have their own future. It does not define it. The definition of the breakup is something more significant, something more radical. Chechnya living separately. This is for many, again, as you said, maybe it's not a problem. But if we look at other ethnic republics, for example, I think the problem here with this argument is that you actually need to have nationalism in order to claim some will to acquire sovereignty and independence. And I don't really see these nationalist movements in other parts of Russia, apart from the Caucasus.
But who knows? I mean, maybe something could develop that is perhaps dormant so far. So I wouldn't dismiss it, but my feeling is it will not be. It will more about territories, at least first, than about ethnicities, apart from the Northern Caucasus. But again, I agree that this is. It reminds me actually the whole constellation now with the annexations reminds me a little bit of the Soviet Union and the annexations of the Baltic republics. So one could speculate whether the Soviet Union would have had a chance to survive without these Baltic republics if Stalin had been sort of less aggressive, and if it had remained the Soviet Union basically of 1922, maybe the Soviet Union would still in one way or another exist. But then these Lithuania in particular, but then the others too, they gave an example. This was then taken up, of course, above all by Ukraine, and then the whole thing broke down. And the Central Asians, they apparently never really wanted to go, but then eventually they went as well. So,
yeah, but Ukraine had a very strong nationalist movement, national democratic movement, especially in the 1980s.
Yeah, yeah. But I wonder whether this would have been enough to without the Baltic example, to trigger the breakup. Who knows? I mean, it's all speculative, alternative history.
But of course, I mean, these national movements, they may develop, although I think the problem at the moment is that it's not only nationalism that you need to have, but also national elites. You know, people, you need actually to have national intellectuals who would be constructing, because as we all know, every nationalist emerges from a mythology of some continuity, of some, even some ritual in a way. So it has, and I don't see it anywhere developing. It may develop, but it will need time. The second point that General Ben Hodges, who is a former commander of the US Army in Europe, he mentioned, the second is that the weakening of the Russian economy. And of course, it's all against the background of the continuing Russian war against Ukraine. So the weakening of the economy, of the Russian economy, may lead to some regions perhaps saying, well, we no longer want to send money to Moscow. And we may want to have some more powers, some more freedom to use our money.
Yeah, I think that is actually going to be maybe the more important factor. The economy is stupid in that now there's still some sort of stability, basic stability in Russia, but who knows how it will be in 1-2 years, and then if the regions are already then in a much worse situation than they are now. Then many of them may think we should go somewhere else, and you have now these alternative sort of paths. Kaliningrad obviously is Western oriented, the Far East is Eastern oriented. So and between them lots of varieties. So I think it's now so difficult to imagine a breakup, because so far, within the Russian Federation, it at least looks on the surface relatively stable. Things are functioning. But if things stop functioning, I think there will be many people who will think, how can we make it again functioning? And if then Moscow cannot help, they may think, let's go to, I don't know, let's have something else, let's be independent, something like that. So I don't think one can dismiss this. I think the economy plays actually, in my view, I don't know what you think, the more important role than ethnic mobilization, which probably would come then later as in a second stage.
Yeah, I think there is this idea that probably social divides may have even more significance in this discussion about the potential breakup. And
of course, as you mentioned, what comes immediately to my mind is, of course, Черный передел. This is the old tradition. It's not about politics; it's about social issues, as it was with the Tsarist Empire, as it was with the Soviet Union. And that may come now up again, and you have these huge divisions, huge inequality, and so far it's stable, but it may not be in the future.
Mikhail Khodorkovsky recently published a book, How to Slay a Dragon. Maybe you've heard of it. It's now available in Russian and in English, and in this book he writes that the threat of the collapse of Russia, the breakup of Russia, is the principal result. Would be a principal result of Putin's war against Ukraine. And he says that one of the reasons for this is that Russia is a fake federation. It's not a real federation. It looks like a unitary state, but it's not a classical unitary state either. So again, regions are sending money to Moscow. They don't have enough powers. They don't have enough rights. And then, against the constitution of the Russian Federation, regions are apparently, or presumably, they should be equal, but they are not equal.
Yeah.
Again, Chechnya comes to mind,
Yeah.
but I would say it's a special region.
But also other, what I know about this sort of asymmetrical pseudo-federalism, if you want to call it that way, is that, for instance, Tatarstan has more rights than many others. So you have then, and even between the ethnic Russian, nominally Russian, you have these inequalities. And again, then comes to mind, of course, that the Soviet Union also was officially a federation. And at the end of the day, these dividing lines between the Soviet republics then became the borders of the new states. And perhaps, one could imagine something here happening too, if economic problems and social problems and other problems then accumulate. That's a good point about this pseudo federation. I mean, there is this this whole idea about the empire that is not really an empire, that has also encouraged nationalism. What is the phrase that is used for this? I've forgotten now. So the paradox of the empire encouraging the nationalism in the empire by creating this pseudo-federal structure. And here I think one could perhaps one day make a partly similar argument that the pseudo-federation actually encourages this centrifugal tendencies.
I guess in some republics now we see this inequality also in terms of how many people are taken for the war. And Buryatia comes to mind, Dagestan comes to mind, and there is a huge inequality between these ethnic republics and also Moscow, more or less European region. So inequality exists, but
affirmative action empire is the term from Soviet history, and something like that could be happening here too. And there's of course a 30-year-old discussion in Russia. One of the proponents was actually Vladimir Zhirinovsky, of people who are saying we should not have any ethnic units. We should have just guberni, because because people feel that this is all a time bomb with these ethnic republics and with the federation, with the federal units who have nominal federal rights, but cannot have these rights, with Moscow being so dominating, but may then demand these rights and then may not get it and then may go for the full separation. So actually the more we talk now about it, the more I start actually believing in the feasibility of this. Although there are of course also arguments, people have said, there are certain central structures like the MVD, the army, the Ministry of Interior.
But we now see the degradation of these institutes,
yes,
because of the war and because of the general sort of even degeneration of the Russian Federation and its elites.
Yeah, and I think when it becomes really interesting is if these power structures get in conflict with each other. The National Guard, the different units that you have, the FSB and so on, if they start quarreling with each other, then I think becomes really interesting. So far, I think they hold the whole thing together and they have the repressive power, but who knows? I mean, in a future transition period, maybe these different power strings, pyramids, they will end up in different clans if they start fighting each other, then the whole thing could be over. I mean, the Russian Federation.
I just remember that actually the Soviet Union was fairer than the current Russian Federation in the sense that in the constitution there was a right of every republic to declare independence,
Yes.
which does not exist in the constitution of the Russian Federation. So, talking about the breakup of Russia as a fantasy, I think Ukrainians are now the major proponents of such a result of the war. But even before the war, I think that this idea was really all-pervasive in the Ukrainian mainstream discourse. I was trying to analyze this, looking critically at this, and I believe that for Ukrainians, but not only for Ukrainians, especially for Central and East Europeans, the breakup of Russia is a sort of alternative to the occupation. So if we're thinking about the defeat of your enemy, historically, it needs to be there needs to be some sort of occupation or some control. You control your enemy who is defeated, but it's not really feasible to occupy Russia. It's just, I think, impossible. At least with its current size, it's just I cannot imagine this. So the breakup is it's an alternative to this occupation.
It would be the ultimate victory in a way.
It would be, yes, and but what I think you said about this черный передел, how would you translate it?
Well, it's the black division, and which is a term from the early 20th century and meant the redivision of the lands from the nobility to the peasants who work on it, so that the peasants who work on the land finally get the land. And that was then one of the major driving force of what then became the so-called October Revolution. And Lenin, of course, promised this land, but with a I mean that analogy doesn't go that far actually. But I think the social question may actually become here for the Russian Federation, for the unity of the Russian Federation, even more important than the national question.
I think now what you see, or at least the processes that are emerging today, and especially if we are talking about Russia's defeat in Ukraine, the process that may lead to this demise of the Russian Federation, to this breakup, is sort of denazirization, turning entire Russia into some sort of Donetsk People's Republic or Luhansk People's Republic, where criminal gangs would probably even have more power, or at least the same amount of power as the, say, law enforcement, official law enforcement. We see now the rise of alternative centers of legitimized violence. ЧВК Wagner, the Wagner private military campaign, they exist in Russia in total violation of the criminal code of the Russian Federation. And it's legitimized. So we have this legitimized alternative that takes away some monopoly of the state on violence. Yeah? And I do believe that in case of some very strange movements and against the background of the defeat, Prigozhin, who's the main I think supporter, the financial supporter of the Wagner Group, may have some claims, political claims too, to control some territory. And there was recently a very interesting report that Prigozhin may want to go into politics. Not just in the shades operating on the underground, but in politics. And it seems that there is a demand for this. With Zhirinovsky gone, Vladimir Zhirinovsky gone, now we have Leonid Slutsky, who replaced him as the leader of this misleadingly named Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, which I know you describe as a neo-fascist party. So Leonid Slutsky, he's unlike Zhirinovsky, he's not a charismatic leader at all. Prigozhin may have, this
I agree.
Can be described as Zhirinovsky on acid.
I mean, that looks already. It indicates already some sort of potential warlordism, that you then have actually, people who control certain structures, armed structures, and have then a claim for power and that could also be something destructive. As long as Putin is able to rule and the economy is more or less functioning, I think that is not topical yet. But if one of these things changes, and especially if both of these things change, I think then becomes interesting. I think for me, it's not so much about some sort of civil society or opposition coming up, but the real interesting thing, and now it's actually getting more interesting with every month, is how these different clans will arrange the succession. And the problem maybe of the regime is not that it doesn't have a successor for Putin, but there are too many potential successors who will have to sort of find an agreement among themselves. And I wonder whether they will find this agreement, because if your own clan is not in power, that can be risky. Then you end up like Ulyukayev in prison, or there were these other Magomedov
or in the basement even.
Yeah. Or Lesin, killed in a hotel somewhere. Mikhail Lesin, who was a minister under Putin,
first presidential.
Yeah. So the stakes are really high, and now you get this. I think I wouldn't have said so before the annexations, the recent annexations of. But now you get this territorial factor in here as well, and Prigozhin's rise and so on. That is now already taking up. I think it's not any longer only about the regime. It's actually about the state.
And then also the question, the fears, the Western fears. As we all know, the West did not want to, at least the US did not want the Soviet Union to collapse. The Soviet Union was a familiar enemy. Basically, the West knew the Soviet Union and knew there were red lines, But now, and the reason why Ukraine had to give up its nuclear weapons was because the US, the Americans, the West in general did not know what that Ukraine was. And obviously now the fear is nukes in the hands of dozens of Prigozhins. Imagine this. And I'm pretty sure that there is no interest in the West. In total contrast to what Putin and people like Naryshkin are saying, that the West is interested in the breakup of the Russian Federation, it's the opposite. I think the West is really interested in having the Russian Federation intact. So what do you say about those fears? Nukes in the hands of Prigozhins.
Yeah, so we're now getting into very sort of speculative territory in terms of the nukes, but I think what one should remember is there's only one command center for the strategic weapons. That was also the case in the early 1990s with Ukraine, which was also one of the reasons that Ukraine then gave up these strategic weapons because it couldn't control them. A different matter could be, of course, tactical nuclear weapons, so-called smaller nuclear ammunition or smaller missiles or bombs. So that could, of course, be very dangerous if that then gets in different hands. I mean, the paradox here is that for the strategic weapons, you have only one command center, but and so maybe there is not so much danger of them actually getting into different hands. The smaller weapons, they don't have the same reach. If they have a smaller reach, they would not be an immediate danger for the European Union, and even less so, of course, for North America. So, but it is now, unfortunately, all of that is now on the table. I'm afraid that needs to be discussed, and I'm sure it's actually discussed in the ministries and the agencies that deal with these issues professionally.
Another fear, and this is the something that General Ben Hodges mentioned as his third factor in discussing the potential breakup of Russia, is the fact of China. So obviously you have this sort of bomb underneath the entire foundation of the Russian Federation, which is the problem of size versus the number of people actually living there. And China with its 1 billion people just on the borders. And of course the fear is that, well, China is considered to be a strategic competitor of the West. It's not the enemy, it's not the technical land, but it's a strategic competitor, and having a chunk of Russia will obviously add a lot to China's geopolitical and economic power. Should we fear China as a potentially having some chunk of Russia?
Yeah, they have this historical discourse, of course, about the lost territories, the unequal treaties of the 19th century. So there is a part, at least it seems, of Chinese nationalism that has actually territorial pretensions.
In Russia as well?
Towards Russia.
Towards
the Siberian part of Russia. So that is something that could come up. But in general, I would think that China would be rather fearing instability, and because it would be instability on the Chinese border. Again, the question is, what could China do then, and whether maybe that would be something for Beijing to see as a chance as well. I mean, what we could also observe in the future is that although Russia is in a way underpopulated, and that it has a huge territory with not that many people, is that there may be even more emigration from Russia in the future.
We already see this wave of immigration.
Well, now because of the mobilization, but if then the economic and social problems accumulate, people may be running out of this relatively empty territory even more so, and then that would be, of course, suggestive to such countries as China. Then maybe we would also have some movement in the other direction, especially on the Russian-Chinese border. So that is also very speculative now, of course, when we talk about that.
Maybe it's counterintuitive, but I do believe that the breakup of Russia, the real breakup of Russia, not just some territories like Chechnya separating from the Federation, but this breakup of Russia may be the only hope for Russian Democrats to have, at least on some territories, to have real democracy. Because I don't believe that there will ever be a chance for democracy if Russia wins, and if Russia still keeps its territory as it is.
Who knows? I mean, I would rather think the other way around, that perhaps democracy could be an instrument to hold the whole thing together. If you would have legitimate elections, if you would have a real decentralization, if you have sort of basically
a real federation.
And perhaps you could even. I've written with a colleague, Valentina Romanova, about this. That maybe rather something like a decentralization as in Ukraine, so that you would actually empower not so much the federal units, which is a tricky thing, because these federal units, as with the Soviet Union, could then claim to become independent states, but rather you would empower local communities. And then you would have the main locus of power in in cities and in territorial communities, and that would be actually perhaps a way to make both Russia non-imperial and to hold it together. But that would, of course, demand a lot of strategic thinking
and willingness as well.
Yeah.
But democratization did not save the Soviet Union. It was in this process of democratization. I think, and Putin. This is why Putin, hates democracy, because he thinks that democracy leads to a breakup.
Yeah, but before the putsch of August 1991, as I said, and with the Baltic republics, the whole thing, because they would never be part of the whole thing, but. Who knows? I mean, if you would have had some sort of confederation, if this Novo-Ogaryovo process would have really started, and you wouldn't have had this putsch, maybe then you could actually have preserved something. I think the putsch, actually, an anti-democratic action was the main thing. I think at the end of the day, I'm not so much worried about whether Russia will be united or not, but rather what kind of entity or entities will emerge there. And in a way, it would make more sense for the Russians to have a decentralized, democratized Russia rather than several sort of new states that are competing or perhaps even fighting each other. So, or center fighting than regional separatism, something like that. So I don't think that one can easily dismiss this idea that sort of a reset of the Russian state as a non-imperial, decentralized, democratic state. But to get there would be, of course, very difficult with the current situation in Moscow.
But I can't see how Russia can be democratic, as such, because it is an empire. It has imperial territories within its borders. It will never cease to be an empire, and also the factor of Russian nationalism. Because if we're talking about Russia's military defeat, you can imagine how much resentment there will be on the part of the Russian nationalists. And they will grow stronger. Yeah. So I do believe that the breakup may be actually the only chance to have democracy, at least on some territory.
The problem here is that whatever we discuss, I think there's so much, and also whatever the West decides, there's now so much internal dynamism, and the war creates this, and so on, that it's very difficult to regulate this or to influence it in any way. And what one can only, I guess, do is basically offer options, and then perhaps hope that at some point people in Moscow will understand all the risks therein. I had actually also the idea that one could basically, from the Western side, offer Russia a certain package, a conditional package of integration or association in the case that Russia becomes democratized and decentralized and non-imperial. So my idea was actually that what was happening to the Eastern Partnership countries before the recent candidate status for Moldova and Ukraine, and the membership perspective for Georgia, is that basically this package that the European Union had until then for Ukraine, Moldova, and so on, could be also something offered to Russia. The association agreement, visa-free regime, a common parliamentary assembly, a civil society forum, and perhaps even at one point NATO association or even NATO membership. But then one could say, here we have this package, but you have to then become a democratic, non-imperial, decentralized country. So here is your, make it or break it. It's your choice now. I mean, that was, I think, still something when I wrote this article like 3 years ago or 5 years ago, that was still something then but now, of course, things have become much more complicated, and that is perhaps now, that option is gone now. The issue of decentralization is perhaps, it's the only chance to keep the country together, if you want to keep it together, if there is enough wisdom and patriotism, you could argue, and if there is enough strategic thinking in Moscow, then I think what the conclusion from that should be that you should devolve power. You have a devolution of power as much as possible and as low as possible, because then you could imagine a large, let's say, federation or confederation or association of local communities, of cities, that would then be as such unable to exist by themselves. So for certain federal units or for their unified or the so-called federal okrugi, the federal districts, you could perhaps imagine that these could be states in a way. But if you would devolve power into the local communities, then actually you could actually prevent the breakup of Russia. But for that you would have to have a lot of sort of
strategic thinking. Yeah. And going back to Nina Khrushchev's quote, everything is possible indeed. So we live in this modernity which changes, and I think there is no limit to possibilities. Yeah. So we'll see. And thanks for this conversation. I hope we will continue discussing interesting topics from a very speculative point of view. And this speculative.
I also wonder where we will speak the next time. Today it was in Berlin. It may be another time in a different city in different country.
My hope, of course, is that at some point we will speak in a Ukrainian Sevastopol.
Right. Yes.
Or somewhere in Crimea.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.